Welcome to part 5 of my Geometry Nodes for Beginners Blender tutorial series. So if you haven't seen the previous parts, then definitely check out the tutorial playlist with the link in the description. So in the last part, we finished the Geometry Node flowers, and I showed you how you can use the curve draw feature to actually draw where you want the flowers to be. And in this part, we are going to create some customizable values here on the side panel so that you can control many values of the flower. And if you'd like to purchase the project files and get this Blender file here with the finished Geometry Nodes flower setup, you can find landscapes. With the terrain panel, so let's just select the flower object and then we'll go back over here to Geometry Nodes. Now I'm going to open up the side panel by dragging this over here so that we can see the actual Geometry Node setup. Now to add the different custom values, we can take different values here that we want to control and we can plug them up here to this group input. So you can see right down here there is an extra dot here, and so we can actually add the values into the group input and it'll show up here on the modifier. So for example, let's say that we want to change the scale of the flower. Well, if we go right over here to the end of the flower center and the petals, we have this transform geometry. And so these scale values can be used to change the flower. So what we can do is take the scale value and we can drag this over here to the group input and we can plug it up here to the extra socket. So when we plug it up to the extra socket, now you can see it's added it, and right over here on the Geometry Nodes modifier, you can actually see the scale value. Now to edit these values further, you can press the N key to open the side panel, and you can click right over here on the Group tab. Now right here there is an interface, and so you can actually rename the different values. So right here, if I double click on this, that will rename it, and I can rename this to flower scale. So now you can actually see it says flower scale. Now there's a problem with this, different values, or X, Y, and Z values, and I instead just want to have one value which will control the entire scale. So to fix this, we can change the type from vector, which is going to be the X, Y, and Z axis. We can change it instead to float by clicking right here on the type, and float is just going to be one single value. Now this default value here, we want to turn this back to 1, and then you can see that the flower is still disappeared. That's because it's scaled down to 0. So on the flower scale, we can just turn that to 1. So now if we go back here to the layout, we don't have to even see the geometry nodes. We can just drag the flower scale value and that'll change the size of the flowers. So let's do that for many more values. So I'll go back here to the geometry nodes. Now I also want to be able to control the amount of petals. So let's go here to the petals, and you can see that here's the petals, and we transformed it and subdivided it, and then we put it here in the instance on points. And the mesh circle, the vertices, is going to have how many petals there are, because if there are more vertices, there's going to be more points. So we can control this by clicking here, dragging over. We can drag it all the way over here and stick it in here. And another way to do this is to actually just drag the group input closer and then plug it up. So now you can see it says vertices, but I instead want to double click on this and I'll rename it to petals amount. So then right over here on the side panel, we have petals amount, and I can make more or less petals. Now I also want to control the center size. So if we go up here to the flower center, you can see right here, if I make this bigger, there is this radius. this bottom, and then there's also the radius top. And so we can change the radius top to make the size of that. So let's put the radius top here, plug that into the extra socket. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I can rename it to center size, or maybe flower center size. Now I also want to control the petals size, so we'll drag the group input down here, and then this cylinder, this is creating the petals. So this radius here, if I drag it bigger or smaller, that is going to change the size of the petals. So let's drag the radius right into here to the extra socket, and I can rename it to petals size. Now we can also change the petals length by going right over here to the instance on points, and we can drag this X here and the Y and the Z. Now I really just want to control the X and the Y, but I don't really care to control the Z. Now instead of just plugging up the scale and having an X and Y value, I want to rename these different values. So what I want to do is break up the values into 3 different values. So there is a node for this. So if I click and drag the scale and then drop here and let go, I can search for the combine XYZ. And here it is, combine XYZ, and then it says vector. So let's click on this and drop it here, and I can actually maybe drag it right over here and then drag this down. So because we've added the combine XYZ, we now have separate values for the X and the Y and the Z. And let's change these all back to 1 because 1 was the default. Alright, so I can now take the X one, this will change the length, and let's drag that into the extra socket here. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'll rename it to petals length. Now the second one here, this Y one, that is going to change the thickness. So let's drag it over here, stick it into the extra socket, and I can rename this to petals thickness. Now you can see with these 2 values, there's this little button here, and I'll show you how to actually use this button. I'll show you what it does later in the tutorial series in the next part, but on these values here, I don't want to be able to see them. So if you select the petals length, you can click on single value and that'll get rid of it, and the petals thickness, click on that to get rid of it. And I will be explaining what that is later in the tutorial series. Now I also want to control the offset of the petals. So if I go back here to the mesh circle, this mesh circle is going to be where they are distributed. So if I drag this, it's going to change the offset. So let's drag the radius here into the extra socket, and I can rename this to petals offset. Now I also want to control the stem thickness. So if I go down here to the stem, you can see there's the curved circle, and that is telling it what it's actually going to be going up the stem. So it's going to tell it the shape, and you can see there's this radius here to change the size of it. So let's put the radius there into that extra socket there, and I'll rename this to stem thickness. Now I also want to be able to control the amount of leaves. So if I zoom out here and go over here to the leaves on stem, we have this density factor, and so this will get rid of the leaves. So let's take the density factor, and I will kind of drag it up here. You can move your mouse into the sides to move it over. Let's stick it here, and then I'll rename this to leaves amount. And then I also want to be able to control the seed just to generate a random seed. So this seed value will kind of generate where the leaves are. So let's drag this seed and stick it here into the extra socket, and we can call it leaves seed. Then I want to be able to control the scale of the leaves. So if I go back here to the instance on points, we have this scale value to change the instances, so to change the size of the leaves. So we'll take the scale value and we're going to stick it here into the extra socket, and then I'll rename it to leaves scale. Now you can see right here, there are 3 values, and I just want it to be 1 value. So just like we did earlier, we want to take the vector, which is X, Y, and Z. We're instead going to change that to float, which is just 1 value. And then the default value, we want to turn that to 1. And then right here, the leave scale, will turn that back to 1 so you can actually see it. Although actually 1 wasn't the default. So if I just unplug this real fast, it's 4.5. So I can press Ctrl Z. So then right here on the default, I want to turn this to a 0.45. And also the leave scale here changes to a 0.45. Now you can see there's also those buttons there that I want to hide. So click on single value, click on leaves amount, and then also, so if we go here to the trim curve, we have this here for where it starts, and then we also have this here for where it ends. So let's take the start, put that in the extra socket, and the end, put that into the extra socket, and then I'll just rename this to leaves start, and this one here I'll rename to leaves end. And then we can again click on single value on both of these, so click on them and click on single value. Alright, let's save this again with Ctrl S, and then we can go back over here to the layout, and we can see what these are doing. So now we have the flower scale, we also have the petals amount, we also have the flower center size and the petals size, and we have the petals length, and the petals thickness, and the petals offset, and then We also have the stem thickness, that's pretty cool. We also have the amount of leaves and the seed. And then we also have the leaves scale to make them bigger or smaller. We also have the leaves start and then also the leaves end. So this is super cool, and we now have this cool geometry nodes modifier, which is going to generate these flowers. So let's press Ctrl S to save, and this will wrap it up for this part. This was a pretty quick part, but we are almost done with the tutorial series, so we just have one more part left, part 6. And in part 6, I'm going to just drag the group input, add the weight. Welcome to part 6 and the final part of my Geometry Nodes for Beginners Blender tutorial series. So in the previous part we took the geometry nodes and we added all these different custom values to control the flower. And so in this part I'm going to show you how to use geometry nodes to distribute all the flowers on the plane to kind of create like a meadow scene. And then I'll also show you how to weight paint the plane so that wherever you weight paint, that's where the flowers will show up. And if you'd like to purchase the finished project files of this tutorial to use as study material or just to use the flowers in your projects, then you can find the product links in the description. And then one more thing before we start, I wanted to let you know about an amazing Blender add-on called Simply Micromesh. With the Simply Micromesh add-on, you can quickly and easily create chainmail. Alright, so to instance these flowers on a plane, we actually need to separate all of these into their own objects. So what I'm going to do is redraw them and then we'll separate them. So I'm going to hit the tab key to go back into edit mode, and if I press the T key to open up this side panel, I'll go back to select box. So I'm now just going to click and drag, and I'm just going to box select these ones, and I will delete them, and then just box select these ones here, and just delete those and those. So I'm now going to draw out the flowers, and every time I draw out a flower, I will separate it into its own object. So let's click here on the draw feature, and then I'm going to draw a flower, and then once I'm done drawing it, I'll press P, and P is going to separate what you have selected. So I'll click on separate, now it's a separate object. I can go here and I can draw again, draw another flower, hit P, and then click on separate. I can draw another one, maybe this will be kind of like a stylized one with it rotating. We'll hit P, click on separate, make another one, P, and then separate, and then we will draw another one, P and then separate, and then maybe like a really small one, P and separate, and another small one, and we'll hit P and then separate that. So now if we go back to object mode, you can see that these are all their own separate objects because we've been separating them whenever we added a new one. Now another thing that I want to do is set the origin points to the very center of the flowers, because wherever the origin points are, that is where the flowers are going to be instanced on the plane. But right now the origin points are like way over here. So just box select all the flowers, and you can click on object, we'll go to set origin, and we'll do origin to geometry. So this way now you can see the origin point is right there in the center of all the flowers, and I can rotate them and they're going to rotate by the origin. Now I also want the origin point to be way down here because I want them to be instanced from the bottom of them. So I'll go to object and separate. P is going to separate what you have selected. So I'll go to front view by hitting the 1 on the numpad, and then I'll go to the first one here, and I'll go into edit mode with the tab key, and I'll move it up so that the bottom of the curve is right there where the origin is, and then tab to go back to object mode. Click on this one, go into edit mode, move it up with the G key, go back to object mode, click on this one, go into edit mode, move it up, go back to object mode, and just continue to do that for all of them. So we're just putting the origin point at the very bottom there so that they will actually come out from where the bottom of the stem is. Alright, just one more, bring that up there, and go back to object mode. And then you can select all of them, and you can like move them down, you can move them down there just like that. So we can now create a plane that we are going to put the flowers on. So I'll go to the add menu, we can go to mesh, and I can add a plane, and I'll scale the plane up really big, and let's just move the plane over. And I can also move the plane down. So now let's go here to the materials, and let's just click on new to add a new material, and I can just rename this to like grass. And then here on the base color, I'm just going to make this like a green color, and I'll make it kind of dark just so we have a simple grass material. Alright, so we're now going to be instancing these on the plane. So we actually want to add geometry nodes to the plane, and we're going to tell it to instance these objects on the plane. Before we do that though, I want all the flowers to be in their own collection, and then we'll be able to tell all of the collection to be instanced onto the ground. So we're going to box select all of the flowers here, and we'll press M, and M is the shortcut key to move. Let's click on new collection, and then I can just rename this to flowers, and I will click on OK. So here on the outliner, you can see here's the default collection, and then here is the flowers collection with all the flowers objects. So let's click on the plane, and we can now click over here to go to the geometry nodes editor, and we can click right up here to add new geometry nodes to the plane. Let me zoom out here. We can click on new, and when we click on new, you can see it automatically adds geometry nodes. And if I click here to rename this, I can just rename this flowers on plane. Alright, so let's press the N key to close that side panel. We'll make this smaller. So to put the flowers onto the plane, we first need to add the instance on points, which we've used many times earlier in the series, to actually put them on the plane. So I'll go to the add menu, and we will search for the instance on points node, and we will put this here between the group input and the group output. Now you can see that the plane disappears. That's because we need to join up the original geometry back up. So again, just like we did earlier in the tutorial series, we'll go to the add menu. We're going to search for the join geometry node, and we'll stick it here at the very end. And then the original geometry, which is the mesh geometry in the 3D viewport, that needs to go here into the geometry. So now we can see the plane. So we now need to add the data of the flowers collection. So I'll go to the add menu, and this time, instead of searching for an object info, we want to search for a collection info because we want to give it the collection data. Let's drop this here, and then if you click here to select it, we can select the flowers collection. So now this instance can go into the instance on points, and now you can see the flowers are going to be on the plane. Now these flowers are really big, so let's just click here and then drag down, and then I can drag left and right to make it bigger or smaller, and let's make that much smaller. So we'll make them really small, something like that. Now there is a problem here, and that is that all the flowers are being instanced together. So you can see if I like move these ones here, it's going to move the other ones. So right now Blender is basically seeing all of these objects as being one object. But instead of them being just one object, I want them to be seen as different objects. So to do this, if we select the plane again, you can see that it's one object because it's kind of all aligned how it is aligned actually in the 3D viewport. So to fix this, we want to click on the separate children and the reset children, and then we're also going to choose the pick instance. So we're going to choose those three. So now you can see that it's choosing a random flower, and it's putting each flower on the vertices there. So wherever the vertices are on the plane. However, I don't want them to be instanced on the points, because as we talked about earlier in the tutorial series, the points on default are just going to use the vertices of the mesh, but right now they are just going to be instanced on each vertice, but I instead want them to be distributed on the faces of the object. So we're going to go to the add menu, and we're again going to search for the distribute points on faces, and we want to put this before the instance on points. So now you can see that the flowers are randomly going to be distributed on the faces here, and if I turn up the density, there's going to be more of them. Now it's also a bit too big still, so let's take the scale values and I'll turn that to like a 0.05 so they're even smaller, maybe even like a 0.04. Now if I turn the density way up, you can see there's going to be flowers overlapping each other. So to fix this, we can take the random and we can change it to Poisson disk instead. So this is a different distribution method. And with this method, we have this distance minimum value. And so this is going to force a distance value in between each flower. So I'm first going to turn the density max way up so they're overlapping, but now I can very slowly just turn the density min up, and you can see if the density min is turned to a 0.14, there's going to be at least a value of 0.14 in between each flower. So now you can see the flowers are more evenly distributed and they're not overlapping. I'm going to turn this down a bit to maybe just like a 0.1. So now we have lots of flowers distributed on that plane. Now the rotation isn't very random, so I want to change the rotation and make it random. So just like we did earlier in the tutorial series, we can add a random value and plug that up to the rotation. So we'll go to the add menu, and we're going to search for a random value node, and we're going to drop this here. So instead of just using one single rotation values, we can take the value and we can put that up to the rotation. But there is a problem here, and that is that it is rotating it randomly around. So randomly, some of these are going to be underneath the plane. So to fix this, I want to be able to control the X, Y, and Z values instead of all of them at once. So we can choose the float here, and we instead want to choose vector. And vector is going to give us the X, Y, and Z axis. So let's put the value back up to the rotation, and now we have the X and the Y, and then also the Z. So the X and the Y, I'm just going to turn to like a very small number of like 0.2 so that it's quite small, so they just rotate just a little bit. But then on the Z here, I can type in a really large number like 1,000, so they are all randomly rotated around on the Z axis. And that is looking much better. Now I also want to add another random value for the scale, because instead of all of them having the same scale, I want to add a bit of scale randomness to make them look a bit more natural. So again, I'll go to the search here, and we already added the random value, so I'll just click there and drop it here, and I can put the value into the scale. And let's also bring this up here and drag this down here. So now with the random scale, there's going to be a minimum value and a maximum value. So on the minimum value, I want to turn this to a really small number, like maybe a 0.01, and then the maximum value is way too big, so let's turn this way down to like a 0.1, and that's still a bit too big, so let's turn it to like a 0.04, actually a 0.04, there we go. And then you can see the minimum value is a bit too small now, so let's turn this up to like a 0.02. That's a bit better. So now all of the flowers are going to be randomly generated between a scale value of 0.02 and 0.04. Now let's say that you want to create a path through the flowers. So to do that, we can actually weight paint on the plane, and then we can actually add the weight paint data into our geometry node setup, and so the flowers will only show up where we've weight painted. Now in order to weight paint, we need to subdivide the mesh, because the weight painting uses the vertices of the object. So let's hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and I'll select everything, and then you can press Control E. Control E will bring up these settings, and let's click on subdivide. And then after we subdivide this, let me just move myself out of the way. Right next to me on the subdivide here, we can turn up the number of cuts. So I'm going to turn this up pretty high to like a 50, maybe even more. So let's turn this up to like an 80, so it is very detailed. And now I can close this. So why I'm making this detailed again is because the weight painting will be more detailed if there is more geometry. So now let's go here to edit mode, and we can change this to the weight paint. So the weight paint is going to start out as a dark blue, but then as we paint, it's going to get a lighter and lighter blue, and then it's going to turn to green, and then yellow, and then orange and red. And so red is basically going to equal 1, and then blue is basically going to equal 0. So wherever it's red, there's going to be more of the flowers, but then wherever it's blue, there's going to be no flowers. And then in the middle, there will be just a few flowers. Now you can see that when I draw this, it's not actually affecting where the flowers are. So to fix this, we need to open up the side panel here. And so what we want to do is we want to have the weight painting be affecting the density factor. So to actually do this, this is a little bit funky in the geometry nodes, but we want the density factor to actually be going into this extra socket here. So we'll put the density factor into this extra socket. Now when we do that, you can see it right here, but you can also see that there is this little button right here, and this is the input attribute toggle. So we can click on this, and then instead of using one single value, we'll be able to use the weight painting data. So we'll click on this, and now it'll change to using different data in Blender, but if you click on it again, it'll go back to using this number value. So let's click on it again, and then if you click on the drop down, we want to use the point group. So choose the point group, and that is going to be the data that we painted. So now you can see that wherever I paint, that is where the flowers are going to show up. So let me just click here and drag out to make the radius bigger, and I can just like paint all along here. And what I could actually do is just paint all in so that it is all red, and then I could just paint away a little path. So let me just paint this all in here. And then also I could turn up the density max here to make even more flowers. And also the distance min, if you wanted to, you could turn it down a little bit to like a 0.09 so there's a bit more flowers. So now to have it get rid of the colors is I can click here on the draw, and this is going to add the different brushes. And instead of having the draw, I'm going to change it to subtract. So now if I start to paint, it's going to get rid of the values instead of adding them. And let me make my brush a little bit bigger. So that's a bit too big. So now if I start to paint here, I can just paint a little path here in the meadow with the flowers. And so again, wherever the blue values are, you won't be able to see any of the flowers. So the flowers will only be in the red values. So I can just kind of paint a little path here, a cool little path, kind of twisting around here. All right, just like that. Let's have it go up again. All right, just like that. So then you can click on the weight painting and you can change it back to object mode. And let's just go back here to the default layout. So now you can see there's a little path here in the flowers. Now another cool thing you could do to make this look more interesting is you could model some different low poly plants. So these low poly plants here are from my low poly nature tutorial, which I created a little while back. So if you'd like to check out that tutorial, I'll have a link in the description and you can learn how to create low poly nature. So what I did in this Blender file is I added a few low poly rocks that I made and a few low poly mushrooms and also some low poly grass. And I show you how to make these in the tutorial. And then what I did is I joined them into the collection with the flowers. So this way we can create a really cool nature scene, kind of a low poly stylized nature scene. And if you do purchase the finished tutorial files, then you'll also get this scene here with these nature assets. So with that finished, this is going to wrap up my Geometry Nodes for Beginners Blender tutorial series. So thank you so much for watching the tutorial series, and I hope it gave you a good understanding of the basics of Geometry Node. drag the group input closer and then plug it up. So now you can see it says vertices. Change it in instead to float. By it's scaled down to 0, so on the more values. So I'll go the vertices is going, and I'll rename it to petals amount. We'll drag the group input down here, and then this cylinder, this is creating the petals. So this radius here over here and stick it in here, and another way to do the amount, and I can make, if we go up here to the this bigger, there is plug that into the extra socket, and this cylinder size. Now we can also change the petals length by going right over here to the instance on point, control the values into, and then here it is, combine XYZ, and then it says vector. So let's click on this and drop it here. So because we've added the combine XYZ, we now have one was drag that into the extra socket here. And then if I double click on this to rename it, or Rename it to petals length. Now the second one here, this Y one, that is going to change the thickness. So let's drag it over here, stick it into the extra socket, and I explaining what that is later in the tutorial series. So if I click and drag the scale and then size. Now we can also change the extra size. So we'll drag the radius here. If I drag it bigger right into here, change the petals here and the Y and the Z. Now I really just want to control the X and the Y, but I don't really care to control the Z. Now, instead of just plugging up the scale and having an X and Y value, I want to rename these different values. Y and to drag the radius. Radius values, so they have separate values for the X and the Y one here. This Y one, that is going to change the group input. So you can see right down here there is an extra. So right over here to the end, values can be used to change the flower. So modifier, you can actually see the scale value. Now to edit these values further, you can press the N key to open the side panel. Change it instead flower scale value, and that'll change the size of the flower scale. We can just turn that to value. Now this default value here, we want to change it in vector, which is going to be the X, Y, and Z flower scale. Now there's a problem with this, and that is that there are X, Y, and Z values, and I instead just want to have one value, add the weight paint data into our, click on separate, to redraw them, and then we'll separate them. And then just box select these ones here and just delete those and those. So I'm now going to draw out the flowers, and every time I draw out a flower, I will separate it into its own object. So let's click here on the draw feature, and then I'm going to draw a flower, and then once I'm done drawing it, I'll press P, and P is going to separate what you have selected. So I'll click on separate. Now it's a separate object. I can go here and I can draw again, draw another flower, hit P, and then click on separate. I can draw another one. Maybe this will be kind of like a stylized one with it rotating. We'll hit P, click on separate, make another one, P, and then separate. And then we will draw another one, P, and then separate, and then maybe like a really small one, P and separate, and another small one, and we'll hit P and then separate that. So now if we go back to object mode, you can see that these are all their own separate objects because we've been separating them whenever we added a new one. Now another thing that I want to do is set the origin points to the very center of the flowers, because wherever the origin points are, that is where the flowers are going to be instanced on the plane. But right now the origin points are like way over here. The flowers, P and then separate, and then maybe like a really small one, P and separate. So now if we go back to object mode, you can see that these are all their own separate objects because we've been separating them whenever we added a new one. Now another thing that I want to do is set the origin points to the very center of the flowers, because wherever the origin points are, that is where the flowers are going to be instanced on the plane. But right now the origin points are like way over here. So just box select all the flowers, and you can click on object. We'll go to set origin, and we'll do origin to geometry. So this way now you can see the origin point is right there in the center of all the flowers, and I can rotate them and they're going to rotate by the origin. Now I also want the origin point to be way down here because I want them to be instanced from the bottom of them. So I'll go to front view by hitting the 1 on the numpad, and then I'll go to the first one here, so that they will actually come out from where the bottom. So we can now create this color. So we're going to box select all of the flowers here, and we'll press M. All right, so let's press selection to make it bigger or smaller. An object, I want them to be seen as choosing 0.14. There's going to be at least a value able to control the X, Y, and Z values instead of all of them at once. I'm just going to large number. So to do that, we can actually weight paint on the plane, and then we can actually control E will it's because the weight now, but then as we paint, it's going to get a lighter. So now let's go here to edit mode and we can change this to the weight paint. So the weight paint is going to start out as a dark blue, but then as we paint, it's going to get a lighter and lighter blue, and then it's going to turn to green and then yellow and then orange. There's when I nodes, but we want the density factor to actually be going into this extra socket here. So we'll put the density factor into this extra socket. Now when we do that, you can see it right here, but you can also see that there's this little button right here, and this is the input attribute toggle. So we can click on this, and then instead of using one single value, we'll be able to use